Hi, everyone. This is our class of Thursday, April 16. It's our class on violence in the context of armed conflicts and civil wars. The question that is taking us here today is why we kill, why armed groups or governments decide to kill civilians in particular. What is it about conflicts and wars that make civilians targets and victims of violence? What are the purposes of that violence? Does it serve a purpose, or is it an irrational, primitive force that produces the violence? And all those are the questions that will have us thinking today. So I'm going to share my screen to start the presentation. Okay, last week we talked about rebel governance. Actually, 2 weeks ago, we were talking about rebel governance and we discussed examples of rebel governance in Syria and Colombia. Now for this week, we will learn what is violence, what is selective and indiscriminate violence, and what type of violence is terrorism, and what are the purposes of terrorism. Okay, so today is going to be a very short class. We will have this presentation, this video that you can look at home at whatever time is better for you. And after watching the video, you should complete the quiz that is going to be posted in the eAulas platform that by the time you watch this video, it is very likely that the quiz will already be there. So go ahead and complete the quiz. So in general, why violence? What is the purpose of violence? Why is violence a phenomena that is so linked to conflicts and wars? So the purpose of violence is basically to instill fear in the population, to make people feel fearful, and through that fear, it is easier to shape people's behavior. It is easier to force them to do what the person or the group that is inflicting violence wants them to do. So it's a way to shape the behavior, and it is done through fear, through the mechanism of fear. So violence can be indiscriminate or selective. There are like two main types of violence. And the majority of violence fall into any of these two categories, selective or indiscriminate. In the particular context of civil wars, violence and the shaping of the behavior of people through fear is linked to the purpose of acquiring and gaining or expanding territorial control. So many armed groups, governments, and armed actors are interested in having control over a territory. So violence, it's a great mechanism to achieve that goal of territorial control. Let's talk first about selective violence. Selective violence is a type of violence that selects its victims on the basis of their individual actions. So a person becomes a target of violence because of the particular characteristics or actions of that person. Let's talk, for instance, of a small town in which a new armed group wants to move in and control. And in that town, there are a few leaders that come from, let's say, their linkages with the church, right? And those people that are the social leaders of that community become the target of violence by an anchor actor that wants to move in and replace the authority that this person enjoys. So the person, the leader, becomes the target of violence, is selected as the target of violence, is selected as the victim on the basis of his or her individual characteristics and actions. Now, the purpose of selective violence in civil wars is very linked to the need of having and gaining territorial control. So, sorry, my daughter is breaching the security of this room where I am recording this class. So she managed to open a locked door. So in civil wars and armed conflicts, rebel groups and governments, they both need really good connections to civilians. They need to have close linkages to civilians. Why? Because civilians are the ones who understand the territory, who know the territory, who know the people, and who have information. Civilians have intelligence, are the source of intelligence, are the source of information. And both governments and rebels, in the context of a war, need really good quality information. Information on what? So information on who is giving information to the other side, right? Information on defectors, if we can call it that way. Information of people that are cooperating with the enemy. Information of where can we get resources. Information on what are the best routes to traverse a territory. So information is key to winning wars. And in order to get that information, the close connections with civilians are very important. So so one of the ways how we get this selective violence is when people or civilians denounce the other people that are cooperating with the other side. And as a response to that, the armed actor or the government is going to kill or inflict violence on that person that is cooperating with the other side. And that will really help the group achieve or increase or expand its territorial control. So in civil wars, selective violence is inflicted with the purpose of eliminating defectors and is also used against those who are in a better position to resist, like leaders, teachers, elders, or those who oppose the ideology. So selective violence is employed to further the goals of the group or the government in terms of expanding ideology, of expanding their territorial control, or with the purpose of neutralizing and eliminating those who will pose resistance. So one of the implications of this, one of the implications of the fact that civilians provide the information that then becomes the basis on which the group or the government inflicts violence on other civilians is that violence is a co-product. It's a product of actions not only of rebels and governments, but also of civilians. Civilians participate in the production of violence because they provide information. So let's think of a little town in which we have, let's say, a guerrilla group, and then I am a person and I have noticed that my neighbor is keeping arms, is keeping weapons for the military. And then I go to the rebel group, to the commander of the rebel group, and I tell him, hey, so I saw weapons of the military at my neighbor's house. And then that commander of the military comes and kills my neighbor. So the one who is killing is the commander of the guerrilla group, right? Is the commander. But that violence was inflicted thanks to the information that I provided. And in order to kill selectively, a lot of information is needed. So generally, selective violence is co-produced between civilians and armed groups. And I'm talking here of a really important theory of violence in civil wars that was written by Statis Calibas. And you can read his books. We have actually read it in this class twice. Then we are going to talk about another type of violence. Now we will talk about indiscriminate violence. And this is the violence that we notice the most, that we see the most. Sometimes it is very misleading because in many cases, groups do little indiscriminate violence, but a lot of selective violence that goes under the radar. And then indiscriminate violence is a type of violence that selects its victims on the basis of their membership in a group and irrespective of their individual actions. So people are selected not because of what that particular individual is or has done, but because of the membership of the person to a group. What group? Let's say a religion, a political party, or living in a given territory. So there are different ways how indiscriminate violence is employed. So one of the ways is to achieve territorial control. So sometimes the groups or the government, they don't have as much information to tell who is who in a town, in a vereda, in a rural territory. They get there, they are stationed there, but they really don't know who is, let's say that we're talking about the government. They don't know who is a member of the guerrilla. They don't know who is cooperating with the guerrilla. They really can't tell the difference between civilians and guerrilla members. And so in these cases in which there is absence of good, fine-grained information and intelligence, where a group does not know for sure who the enemy is, indiscriminate violence is employed. So there is like this quote, beautiful quote to reflect this, that says, while the party had 1,000 eyes and 1,000 ears, the armed forces were blind, or rather colorblind. So this talks about the inability in many conflicts of governments or even of invading forces. Let's think of, for instance, on the US in Iraq and Afghanistan, to really have enough information to tell who the enemy is, who is who. And when that happens, they think that everybody is the enemy, right? That everybody is cooperating with the rebel group or cooperating with the enemy. And since it seems like everybody is cooperating, so everybody should be the victim of violence. So in this context, our actors use indiscriminate violence to prevent and stop collaboration with the enemy. So it forces, why? Because this type of violence forces the innocent to denounce the guilty, so it finally achieves the purpose of denunciation. So for instance, if let's say that I am Bashar al-Assad and I am the president of Syria, and then there is an insurgency in my country, and I know that that insurgency has a lot of support in some particular towns of my country, and then I don't have enough information to tell who really is a member of this rebellion. And so I go to Homs or to Aleppo and I bomb the entire city. And I bomb it, right? Like I destroy it through shelling and bombs. And so I victimize so many people, the majority of whom are probably not members of the rebellion. Some of them might support the rebellion. But then when I do that type of action, that type of indiscriminate violence, sometimes it works because then I prompt or I force innocent people to denounce the guilty. So since the person has been the victim of this shelling and a person has lost his roof and his house, then that person will go to government forces and tell government forces, you know, my neighbor is member of the rebellion. My member is part of the group. So indiscriminate violence forces the innocent to denounce the guilty. Sometimes also indiscriminate violence deters the guilty from cooperating or deters people from cooperating. So in the same example, if I am a citizen of Aleppo, my city was just bombed by the government because in my city it's a stronghold of the rebel group, then I might feel sympathies towards the rebel group. I might feel that I want to join, but after the shelling from the government and such amount of indiscriminate violence, I really prefer not to do it. So it deters people from cooperating with the other side. So this is one of the uses or the reasons why indiscriminate violence is not irrational. It's not something that doesn't have sense. No, actually, it is employed very frequently by governments and groups, and it is employed in contexts in which they do not have enough presence in a territory to have fine-grained information on who in concrete is the enemy. So some examples of indiscriminate violence in Colombia, we have El Salado massacre, a massacre that occurred between February 16 and February 22 in the year 2000. 66 people were killed by paramilitary forces, women, children, lots of peasants, and they were targeted by the paramilitary groups because according to the discourse of the paramilitary group, everybody in that territory was a cooperator of the FARC guerrilla. So they were targeted because they lived in a territory that had been controlled by the FARC, where the FARC had a lot of presence. And in the views of the paramilitary groups, everybody was guilty. So everybody had to be victimized. Another example is the Dos R's massacre, a massacre by the Guatemala, Nicaragua. I am not sure. I might have made a mistake here. But anyways, if you guys have time, I invite you to listen to a really fantastic, phenomenal episode of a podcast that I really like. It's called This American Life, in which they talk about the Dos R's massacre and a kid that came out of it, that was a survivor, but that was lost for a very long period of time. It's a beautiful, heart-wrenching podcast by This American Life, and I will post the link if you have time, if you want to listen to something different. I invite you to do that. So that is one of the purposes of indiscriminate violence, to gain territorial control, to deter people from cooperating with the other group, to force civilians to denounce who is cooperating with the other group in a context in which groups are fighting for territorial control. But also indiscriminate violence is also used for eliminating and exterminating the other in contexts in which the other, like that particular animosity, is the fuel of the conflict. So the side that inflicts violence, they don't want the cooperation of civilians. What they want is the elimination of civilians. They want to drive people out of the land, to kill everybody. Why? Because that people in that particular territory, they are members of an ethnic group, they are members of a different religion, right? We are talking a lot about ethno-nationalist violence that is very indiscriminate, because people are targeted because of their membership with a religion or an ethnicity. And so here again, the purpose is not getting the cooperation of civilians, but eliminating civilians. And we will talk about one super important instance of this type of violence next class, when we talk about the Rwandan genocide. And then we have terrorism. So terrorism is a particular different type of indiscriminate violence. It is indiscriminate violence. People are like, the purpose of terrorism is the targeting of innocents, right? Of civilians that do not take part on government's decisions in the majority, or through very indirect links like voting. And then terrorism is an act of terror. It's a type of violence that has the goal of forcing the opponent into making concessions. And one of the aspects that is distinct of terrorism is that the violence is inflicted, but the audience of that violence, or the target of that violence, is different. It's not the victims, it's a larger, wider audience. Sometimes the governments, sometimes the entire country, sometimes the international community. So for instance, a bombing of the concert hall in France, the target of that violence were not the people in that concert hall. The target of that violence was the French state, right? It wanted to reach a wider audience, the French state and the French society. So terrorism gets to that goal, achieves that goal of forcing the opponent into making concessions through several ways. There are several ways how terrorism achieves this: attrition, advertising the cause, provocation, and spoiling. So these four are the four main reasons why terrorism is employed by terrorist organizations and rebel groups. So why is terrorism employed? Many times terrorists is employed to achieve attrition. And attrition is the process of reducing something's strength or effectiveness through sustained attack or pressure. So terrorism has the potential of undermining the opponent's will rather than its capacity to fight. So that's the reason why terrorists is the weapons of the weak, because as this quote says, you have to be lucky every day, telling the government. We only have to be lucky once. So terrorists is a weapon of the weak, because it is really easy. It's much easier to do a terrorist attack than, let's say, control a territory, right? And it is cheap. It makes civilians pressure governments, and it communicates that more harm will come and that no boundaries is respected. So when a group does a lot of this type of attacks, a lot of terrorist attacks, then it will force government into making concessions because of attrition, because the government will lose strength. It will be very pressured. Another of the goals that is achieved through terrorism is the advertisement of the cause. So terrorism can publicize grievances in conflicts that are just starting. It can communicate messages to international audiences or audiences that are very far away from the aggrieved. And sometimes it is exactly what rebel and terrorist groups want. So for instance, in May 2013, Iraq, there were dozens of attacks by ISIS in several cities during a week-long campaign that had the purpose of advertising ISIS, and it left 449 deaths. Another cases are the killings in Charlie Hebdo, the shooting in Charlie Hebdo by Al Qaeda Yemen, that also had the purpose of publicizing the Yemen conflict. So another of the goals that are achieved through terrorism is provocation, because terrorism can be used to mobilize support by forcing the state to overreact or crack down the constituency of the terrorist organization and produce new grievances. So many argue that one of the purposes of Al-Qaeda in 9/11, for instance, was to force, to provoke and completely indiscriminate reaction by the US, right, to provoke the other. So if I hit, let's say, if I go to a big city and I put a bomb and I hit and then I kill a lot of people, then I will probably prompt, through civilian pressure, the government to act against me in the places in which I am strong. And that reaction will probably be undiscriminate. It will probably be very out of proportion. And that crackdown will probably lead the people that live in the area where I am strong to feel aggrieved by the government, with the government, and to support me. So it can have, it can reacting against a terrorist attack can really can be really counterproductive for governments. Then another of the reasons why terrorism is employed is to outbid. When we have competition between rival groups, then they might compete to claim who will represent the aggrieved population. And this is something that we observe in the competition between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, in which they are competing for claiming the representation of those very radical people. And lastly, terrorism is also used for spoiling. Sometimes a group can launch terrorist attacks to spoil a peace process with a more moderate group that would make them obsolete. So in a case in which we have several rebel groups and there is a peace agreement with one of those groups, then one of the groups that is outside the peace agreement might want to do terrorist attacks to boycott the peace agreement, basically to spoil it, to damage it, to damage the legitimacy of the peace agreement. Because in a context in which there are terrorist attacks, people feel that there should not be concessions with the armed group. So this is something that is observed in Colombia, the actions of the ELN in the past years, especially in 2016, 2017, in the early moments of the implementation of the peace agreement with the FARC, in which the ELN achieved several terrorist attacks with the purpose, it seemed, of spoiling the peace agreement with the FARC. So to conclude today's class on violence and the causes of violence and the logics of violence, we had selective violence that has the purpose of increasing the control over a territory, of achieving a group's goals through targeting those who could resist, those who are against their ideology. And then we have indiscriminate violence. Indiscriminate violence in the context of civil wars can be very counterproductive because it can entice resentment and anger, and that can prompt innocents to collaborate with the other side. But then if the other side is very, very, very weak, then indiscriminate violence might actually work. And indiscriminate violence used by terrorist groups might actually work as well when the purposes are outbidding, spoiling, attrition, and provocation. So thank you very much for following me this far. Please complete the quiz and see you next class to talk about the Rwandan genocide. It's going to be a phenomenal class. Please do not miss it. Bye.